I move to approve last month's meeting minutes.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Alright, so then we have the 7, 8, and 9s, which we visited last time, and we had a few
They can come
notes
in.
and changes on there. I didn't know if there was anything that directors of the team needed to highlight on those three. I figured we'd just take them all together because we did run through them once before. And we had very minor little changes, which I think have gone through my notes as to what we were changing. So just take a second, see if anybody had anything new to add to those.
I had a question from a board member that's not here about policy in the 900 series around drones, because we had kind of had some feedback about drones at an athletic practice or something, and they'd asked if we'd given permission for any drone, because I think it says the superintendent needs to grant permission for that to happen, and we have not had any of those requests, nor have we granted them. So if something's happened, it's probably happened outside of our policy and would need to be reported to us. So that was one question I got on those. Nothing as far as a substance change to the policy, just more of a question.
Yeah, how are we enforcing the policy?
Yeah.
That's what that sounds like.
Yeah, I have also heard concerns around the use of drones at football games and whatnot.
Right,
I don't know how-
outsiders? Well, I'm assuming they would have to be like news people.
Well,
I think like trying to get
Yeah,
scouting
intel,
reports
yeah.
for the other team until, some things like that, so,
Okay.
yeah. More poor behavior and just trying to cut some corners, so there's one concern we had followed up on.
If there isn't anything on the 7s, 8s, and 9s, I think we can move into our item 4, sort of a review of our investigation policies and whatnot, which is kind of scattered throughout
Yeah.
multiple places, so I'll kick it over to Matt.
Sure, and Charlie actually brought this up, I think, at a board meeting in agenda setting or in one portion of what we were talking about, so I don't know if Charlie's earlier or if he just joined us for the conversation, but wanted to thank him for bringing that point to us, because we have had a number of investigations this year, more than likely, and a lot of them are kind of athletic arena with different coaches and some concerns that way. So I've met a couple different times with Janet Ombuds, Eric, our Director of Equity and Employee Relations, Chase, of course, and then Nick as he's transitioning over to that HR role, and then Brady and I have had a lot of talk about this as we go throughout too. And so I think there's a few things that we really wanted to emphasize over the summer from probably a clarity and expectation standpoint, and then also some training for building-based staff, and also just some refinement of protocols to make sure that we're being tight around the processes that we do have. And so a few of those things that I'll go through here in this list, you're going to hear some that happen at the beginning of the process, and then some that should happen at the end of the process. I'm happy to try to elaborate on any more of those, or if we need a follow-up conversation, we'd invite some other team members in, but this will be some of our work over the summer to make sure we have a good process set up in the fall, or that we continue to refine that process we use. So one would be identifying specific allegations that must be reported to the ESC, so to make sure we have great clarity in that with our building-based staff, all the way from principals down to the teacher coach level. Even volunteers for that matter should be familiar with some of those processes when there's a concern. The timeline of reporting those allegations to the ESC, again, trying to gather some clarity around that if you hear a concern, here's the expectation of how quickly that should be reported to us. And then once an investigation begins, we also want to have a timeline expectation for when people could expect that investigation to be started and concluded. Sometimes that's not always easy to project on the front end, but we can create touch points in that investigation to say, if you have brought us this concern, you should expect to hear a follow-up from us in said number of days, or a week or 2 weeks, whatever that might be, just so there's an expectation there of some kind of ongoing communication once the concern is filed. And then I would say a development of a communication plan along those same lines for flow of information to individuals making those claims. And so it kind of goes along with the timeline, like what should you expect for flow of information and communication back? If students bring forward a concern, do they know when they'll hear from us again? If a parent or community member brings that concern, when can they expect to hear some information back at the beginning and throughout the process. And then a development of a standard closeout process that includes probably a lot of different things, but anytime we close out an investigation, that can surface a lot of emotions for people, right? Whether it's a founded concern or it's an unfounded concern, there has to be a better close to the communication loop than I think we've had in a few instances this year. So report for the accuser and the accused, communication of available resources, communication with building for some follow-up, and then procedure for closing out an ESC investigation involvement and turning the matter back over to the building over to the building administration. So you might think about this like, we do the investigation, we make a determination on if something's founded or unfounded, and then we're also working through a process that the person that completes the investigation is not necessarily the one that institutes the discipline. So it's more ideal that the person that creates the findings then turns that over, and there's another party involved that would do the discipline. That could be our HR team that would do the discipline, or that could be a building-based administrator, given some parameters around what that discipline could or should look like, depending on the scenario. So we think that's an important process to people to know too. There's some other things that can be unearthed in investigations that would just be good for a supervisor to know as well. So even if it's not something where there'd either be a reprimand or a suspension or something to that level, it could be good that the evaluator would know, hey, well, this investigation happened, here's what we learned. And so we need a cleaner process for how that is also handled. And then the last thing I say, and I would take your questions, would be making sure that any appeal process that is available to those people is well known. Sometimes there are routes for an appeal, but say on a level 1 type investigation, there's really no avenue for an appeal on that. I mean, the investigation's complete, and then their remedy would really be to go to local judicial system here, no other remedy in the district. But there may be other times where, yes, they could appeal to the superintendent or designee in that circumstance. So those are the few of the things I know that the team is actively working on and that we've identified as just some process and protocol pieces we need to tighten up. I don't want to say those things to give you also the perception that none of those things are happening, but I think we could probably also relate that in some of those areas we've had some things that could have been done better and that we need to continue to try to improve on. Charlie, I thought maybe you were going to ask a question there at one point. Did I misread you?
I was just trying to make sure we knew, what, as a policy and governance committee, right? Like which parts of our policies are we looking at? Are we looking at making sure the process is well documented on the student side and staff side? I mean, the discussions lately have been sort of student centered, but I'm sure there's other things we want to make sure we're all buttoned up on other folks making complaints, right?
Yeah, well, I thought where maybe you were going with your question, Sean, would be when we would have some of these things ready, I think to probably say if there's significant change or substantive change to our process and it would either conflict with our policy or we would take some edits to policy, that's what we would bring back to this group to say, okay, now that we've worked through this and want to make sure this is consistently incorporated, we need to make sure it talks to our policy accurately. We haven't done that level of revision yet. I think we'd first like to establish what's the right process and then go back to the policy and say, is that included or do we need to do some edits there to make that happen?
I think that's fair. I just want to make sure that, because we have similar language on complaint processes and like discrimination, all these different things, like they show up in maybe slightly different ways in different places. And if we come up with a process that, we want it to be standard and what we're following, I mean, it should be applicable everywhere. I mean, I understand that not everybody's the same, but I mean, the process should be pretty basic, basically the same for all those groups. I just want, I think you're right, come up with a process that's going to work, and then we try and figure out how it slides into all the various places, maybe after the fact.
Right, and there may be even some uniqueness based on what type of investigation we're doing, but there should probably be some common elements and themes in those investigations, right? Like that closeout part, well, that can be an element of all of those, no matter how that looks. It just might have to look different based on the type of investigation we're doing. But I think those are those are the common elements we want to make sure are reflected in our policies about if we're committing to doing something for an investigatory process, that it's there in all of those.
Yeah, I did, the highlights that I wrote down here as you were talking, I think are common enough that they should apply, right? Like
Yep.
a timeline for reporting, a timeline for a response, a communication plan, a closeout process, and a well-known appeal process. Like, I think those are all things that should, in one form or another, in all of them. The appeal process would be different depending on what it is, but it should be known what it is, or if it's available, at least. So.
What's the current practice for closing out and conveying the results? What do we do right
Yeah,
now?
well, I think that's an area we've probably had some difficulty, right? I mean, of course, the process is to make sure the findings are communicated to the accused and the accuser, but I think probably the way that's felt to some of those folks involved and the way that's been delivered this year is an area we've targeted for some improvement, right? Because if it comes back in email, fashion, and then I think we also have a conversation started around some of that's went straight to students, and I'm not sure that's always the best route, that if students have filed a concern, giving that result back to them in the middle of the school day is probably not an ideal step for us. And so thinking about how we maybe communicate that first back to parents and then give them an opportunity to communicate with their child, and then at a later time say, hey, we will be sharing this with your student because they're the one who filed it, but we're not going to do that until said time and date or something like that, or if you give us notice that you've shared it with them, then we won't. So that'd be one example, Jane, where I'd say we do it, but can we do it better? I think there's probably some opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I think if we know that the conclusion is going to be upsetting for the party that was reporting, that a good practice would be to do that in person, rather than, I mean, if it's the result that they want, then maybe my email would be fine. But I think if we know it's going to be upsetting to them, sending them an email, when, if in the middle of the day when they can't respond to it, or on the weekend when there's no one that they can reach, that maybe that is something that could be modified.
I would challenge that a little bit in that I think the response should be the same.
Really?
Like, I mean, if you're gonna have a process of how you're gonna report it out, I don't think you need to wonder how it's gonna be taken. I mean, the answer is what the answer is, and sometimes it's not gonna be taken well, sometimes it is.
Then maybe
If
it should always
being
be
in person is the better,
yeah.
like, I'm okay
Yeah.
with that, right,
Yeah.
as being the standard, but I don't think we should
Well,
do one for one.
Okay.
but just plain devil advocate, the issue with doing it in person, people's schedules.
Right.
And so that draws it out even longer,
Sure.
depending on who all will be at that meeting. That's something to think about, just because when you're dealing with, just example, if it's a teacher, parent, that parent may want somebody there with them, that teacher may want somebody there with them, teacher schedules don't always match up with district schedules, so that's just something to
Yeah,
keep in
that's a
mind,
good point.
that
Yeah.
draws out the closeout.
But I wonder, what about a phone call rather than an email? I don't know.
Yeah,
I think the theme is,
Yeah.
right, there's just gotta be greater care with it.
Yeah.
I think
Right,
that's the
exactly.
theme we've established,
Yeah.
is that, there needs to be some better TLC with that process.
Absolutely.
And that's why I said, we've
Yeah.
identified that maybe it needs to involve some parents.
Yeah.
I think Ruthina's point is valid, and probably why we've done it the way we've done, as far as, people finding out at the same time, that we wouldn't want one party finding out ahead of another one. But trying to structure that out and make sure that we have some greater care with it, I think has to be a priority.
And it could be some sort of hybrid too, right? Like, here's the result. If you would like to,
Right.
further contact
Yeah.
or more information, then we could schedule something, something like that too, right? But the process I think should be the same all the time. Did you have a question, Charlie?
So I might just chip in here. One of the issues I think that I had or considering is whether the actual investigatory process, one, if we're sure it's thorough, if it's unbiased, and if it's rigorous. And I'm not quite sure how that can be put into language in a policy, but I suspect it could be. We're not a law enforcement agency, so we don't have people that are practiced, skilled, and trained in investigation.
Well, I would say our
Our
investigators are trained, you know,
They are,
in
okay.
those skills, right? And so, I mean, yes, I would answer in the affirmative that I do believe they're thorough, rigorous, and unbiased. I think bias is always a hard one to say is totally out of anything. I think we've all learned that, right, as we look at systems and some of that work. But at the same time, I do think that, you know, that's our goal every time in doing that work. I also agree with you. I think that can easily be codified into language, right? That's our commitment to trying to do these investigations, is that it's thorough, rigorous, and unbiased, you know, to the greatest extent possible with those tools. I think for us, looking at some of these safeguards we're mentioning, is those allow us to probably do that on a greater level, right? To make sure that we can do that more. I think people would like to see all of the steps sometimes publicly that we do for an investigation, and that's not something that would be a best practice from investigations, is to share that with people,
Right.
because that can change on the nature of the, yeah, they want to know, well, who all did you interview?
Yeah.
Did you talk? And that's not something we would recommend that we would put out publicly to folks. And so I think those guarantees we can make on the front and back end of that process that we kind of walk through here is some of the best things we can do to try to make this feel better.
That's a good point, Matt. So if, it wouldn't be a good practice to disclose a detailed report of an investigation generally to the public. But I think it would be a good practice to have the central administration to look at investigations and make some analysis of whether or not that particular investigation meets our standards.
Sure. And that's where Janet's been able to give us some good feedback too, honestly, right? I mean, because she has people that reach out to her with concerns around these, and so she's able to come back and share some themes with me about areas for improvement. And so she's been a great partner in this work too, as we look through that. And she has a great background in, you know, doing that work for the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission and being an investigator herself. And so she brings some good tools to the team too that way.
Okay.
All of that will challenge the timeline. I mean, that's what, the
Yep.
first points, if you say it's gonna be 5 days or the expectation, I mean, all of those things just by their nature,
Right.
especially if you have 2 or 3 that are happening simultaneously but are unrelated to one another. It's just, that's, you know.
And that's kind of
why I
what
get
caught us a
cautious.
few
I
times
do.
this year, is just the sheer
Yeah.
volume of
Yep.
investigations we're trying to manage at one time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, like we discussed, right, let's get that process put together and buttoned
That
up.
we would
and
follow
then
back
we'll
up with this team.
Yeah.
Slide it into the policies. Any last minute thoughts on that? We've got a lot to get done tonight, so I don't want to belabor it if we're good to go. All right, so the only thing up here is our next policy and governance committee meeting. So the next, like, scheduled one wouldn't be until September. But if something like this were to get done between now and then, I think we'd probably want to try and find a time to convene to work it out. But our next schedule would be September 20th, I think is
Yep.
the right date. With that, I think I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Bye.